Hello and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Osceola Seminole Sidelines. My name is Pat Burnham, and I am joined today by Rivals National Recruiting Analyst John Garcia Jr. John, welcome.
Good to be back on with you, Pat.
Yeah, man, it's been a while. And of course, as we were talking before we started taping, never a slow time. You've been very busy. In fact, you just sent out an article right before you popped on about some of the fast risers in the state of Florida. And I got a couple questions on some of those kids. But one of the reasons we're having you on, John, is we just set the linebacker board for Florida State's 2026 recruiting class. And of course, several of those prospects are in South Florida, so we thought it'd be a good time to have you on. So let's dive right in. Of course, the news last week was Florida State got the commitment of Karon Maycock, the four-star linebacker. First of all, you've had an update on Karon since then, but let's talk about overall about what you thought about him as a player and Florida State getting that commitment at such an early stage.
Yeah, Maycock is a fascinating recruit on the field. He was a safety earlier in his high school career, but just kind of kept getting bigger. So at Miami Central, they moved him into the box as an inside linebacker, playing right next to Ezekiel Marcelin, another four-star guy. And let me tell you, that move changed everything for Maycock. I think his recruitment started to pick up steam because this is a guy who carries 215 pounds, but he looks like he's 190 out on the field. He's incredibly swift, moves very well, but he's physical. I mean, that's really the calling card of any, front seven defender at Miami Central. If you're not hitting, you're not out there. So he was able to convert down the linebacker and really not only not miss a beat, but look better, look more impactful as a second level defender. So I think that versatility comes into play with him. He can cover, he can run, he can hit, he can blitz, he can do a little bit of everything out there. And he actually told us, when he committed to the Noles, they like him as a nickel. And it's a big nickel, but when you think of the old school, hey, it's a sub package, right? So you're subbing out a linebacker for a cover guy. Well, if he's the same size as the linebacker, can still move like that, pretty advantageous for your defense. So I really like him as a prospect, and I think he's only scratching the surface of what his game will become as a 3-down linebacker. We know about the coverage stuff, third down stuff, but the first and second down stuff's only going to get better, and he's off to a really nice start. So this is a huge get. Miami thought this one was, trending their way. A lot of schools are trying to get involved with him just now as they circle back to junior high school tape. So the timing of the commitment really strong for Florida State, especially with that new coaching staff on the defensive side. Really, really.
And of course, we talked about it last week with Sam and at the Osceola.com. I know you got some comments for him, and then I broke down his film. So if you want to see what he had to say to John after his commitment and what we thought about him on film, please go to the Osceola.com or floridastate.rivals.com, and you can find those articles there. But listen, recruiting is never over. It's fluid, and probably none more so than now that we're in the NIL and portal era. Listen, he announces that he's going to commit to Florida State, then within a day or two has obviously planned an official visit to Alabama. Listen, that's not new. We saw Jamarian Matthews commit to Alabama last week, and the very next day confirmed with us that he is going to still take an official visit to Florida State. But what is your read on that? I mean, it seems like maybe Kalen DeBoer and his staff are kind of finding their feet now in recruiting in the Southeast, something they did not have a lot of familiarity with last year when they first came on board. And this is really their first full recruiting cycle. But how do you read into him scheduling that official visit so quickly after his commitment to Florida State?
Yeah, Pat, we mentioned that a lot of teams were just now clicking on the tape and saying, well, this kid can absolutely go. And they're extending scholarship offers. And Alabama is one of the most recent, that Maycock had picked up and added to his list, which I think will still grow here going forward. So, yeah, you knew that at some point there was going to be, visit talk, and an official visit was something that has been discussed. Basically, nowadays, it's from the moment the offer is extended the OV. If it's a true priority prospect, a guy who's on the board, not just a courtesy offer that we also do see, they talk offer. Hey, we love you. Also, hey, when can we get you on campus? Officially. So I think that was the conversation with Maycock, and something that, like you said, we should just expect. I mean, these
Yep.
kids are going to explore their options. Karon's a Miami guy, very familiar with Miami, Florida, and Florida State, as you would expect, but not so much out of the state. So this is an opportunity that I think those around him will say, hey, this is something that you have to explore, you have to vet. But I do think the commitment to FSU was a legitimate verbal commitment. I don't think this is a placeholding situation. This is one where a lot of people assumed Miami led, and I actually joked with him about it a few weeks ago at a 7-on-7 tryout, and he said, yeah, it might be another team in the state. So this is something that wasn't spur of the moment. The FSU had kind of quietly hung near the top of this race, and obviously able to get him on campus in late January, where he confirmed to you guys that FSU was indeed the leader before this verbal commitment. So I do think that it's not going to be easy for another program to pull them off of this Florida State pledge, even though it is still only February and we've got 10 months to go until things can become official. But Maycock's a good player, so he's going to be pushed by other programs. That's something that if you're a great program, you got to deal with anyway.
Yeah, not a linebacker, but obviously a Florida State commit and has been for a while. And you knew when he committed as a sophomore that his recruitment was just heating up. But Daryl Trey Bell, the nickelback from down in South Florida, has also committed to taking an official visit to Alabama. This was going to be prior to his official visit. Both of these visits are going to be prior to their official visit with Florida State, which I think always bodes well. I kind of like the getting the last visit type situation because your friend last school on their mind, last impressions. What do you make of Trey's going to Alabama for an official visit right now? I believe it's the only other official visit he has set up. I would expect that to change as we get closer to June. But anything to be worried about if you're a Florida State fan there?
Yeah, I think this is the opposite of Maycock, right? This is a kid who jumped on board so early and sort of blew up as a blue chipper 2 years ago. So yeah, he started compiling all these offers, but he was committed to FSU, and that was kind of it. So as time has gone on and now he's in the official visit window, and let's be honest, there's been a lot of coaching change and turnover in Tallahassee. Those around him are like, hey, you got to make sure. So you schedule the FSU trip, and then you see what else is out there. So Bama's got, the first one on board. He did tell me he's talking to Michigan and Louisville. Auburn just re-offered him this week as well. So he's going to take other trips as you would imagine. But I think this is a different situation. This is one where there's so much familiarity and comfort with Florida State. This is true due diligence. Hey, I've been planning to go to this school for so very long. Let me just make sure, in case something does happen. And obviously it's college football. So things happen as soon as the weather turns and we get closer to Thanksgiving, domino season is here. So I think it's just a due diligence sort of vetting from a really smart and heady kid and football player. So this is one, to keep an eye on. But like you said, both of these official visits elsewhere for these guys, FSU is going to get the last trip or a trip later than the school that might be considered a top threat. And they're not going to visit Bama together, even though they're both Miami guys, both DBs, and both on the Miami Raw 7-on-7 team. They're visiting in consecutive weekends over at Alabama, not together. So I do think that's something to keep in mind as you try to figure out how much of a threat, Alabama or these other schools might be. It's not like these guys are like, hey, we need to go see Bama together. So I do think that adds a layer to the conversation.
Yeah, a couple of uncommitted linebackers that I wanted to ask you about, and I'm going to screw up his name. First name, Duan Forkpaw, the Braden and IMG linebacker, originally from Minnesota. Listen, he's been on Florida State's campus a number of times, more so than any other reported unofficial visits from any other site or any other school. I've got Florida State as a leader. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I think so. You got to track the visits, especially when it's a non-native, as you mentioned. This is a guy who's come down to IMG Academy, and he could have started frequenting any of the campuses in the state or beyond, and it's been up to Tallahassee, which is not a hop, skip, and a jump.
No, that's
It's
a
a
good
couple
try.
jumps
Yeah.
away, from Bradenton. So I think those are intentional, and those are things you have to track, especially when you're talking about a kid getting in the car and driving or being driven, that many times, to one place. So I agree with you there. I do think, however, his move to IMG will be interesting for other schools,
Yes.
because when you talk about spring ball, every school in the world that plays football is going to try to stop at IMG Academy. And Fork was a great looking kid who's going to factor into a great defense, as we see every year down at IMG. So, I do think other opportunities could come in to potentially challenge Florida State. So when we see him later this week at the pro day and later on, very curious to know the timeline, because he's saying the right things. He's visiting Florida State a ton, but we know there's a lot of linebackers on this board as well. So you wonder not only where he's at from a timeline
Yep.
perspective, but how much Florida State's trying to push to maybe wrap this thing up, because there are a bevy of blue chippers at that position that FSU's right in it for.
Yeah, and right now he's got OV scheduled to Florida State, Minnesota, and Michigan. And as you said, I think that number's probably going to grow, particularly when these coaches start coming through in April and May for spring football in the state of Florida. Listen, this guy's kind of an enigma. Nobody really knows what to make of him. He's been committed to 3 schools, decommitted from 3 schools. Still one of the most highly sought after linebackers in the state of Florida, if not the country, but a 4-star linebacker, Isaiah Williams. How do you read? I mean, obviously he's been to Florida State a couple of times. Has got an official visit locked in for June 20th. He's going to go to Penn State, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Colorado before he gets to Tallahassee. Tallahassee is right now scheduled. Florida State scheduled to get that last official visit. Of course, now listen, they can visit schools in the calendar's different than it ever has been. They can still schedule official visits in the fall, but how do you read into the tea leaves in Williams' recruitment? And I wrote the other day that I think this is going to come down to whatever day early National Signing Day is in December, whatever, December 4th, 5th, 6th, whatever it turns out to be. How do you read? What are you reading into his recruitment right now?
100%. I think you're right. This is one. First of all, let's start with the player. I mean, 6'3", 212, just ran 4.41 at Under
Yes.
Armour Orlando. He's 11 flat in the 100. He's got incredibly long arms. He's got pass rushing experience. Last year, he moved to the traditional inside linebacker role. So this is a guy that fits your board regardless of the scheme. And obviously, if you're a measurables guy, hey, it doesn't get much prettier than 6'3", 212 with a 4.41 laser. So, his recruiting stock has been on the rise seemingly for 2 years, but we're not done yet. That was just the other day where he clocked that time. So Texas is now in there. Oklahoma is now in there. He's being pursued heavily by Bill Belichick at North Carolina. So I do think the in-state schools will always have the advantage. Like you said, committed to Florida State, grew up a Gators fan. So Florida's going to have a say before all is said and done. Miami is absolutely pushing to keep him in state as well. So I think it personally comes down to the big 3 in the end. But when Georgia and Colorado and Texas and these other schools are pursuing, you've got to listen. So I do think a lot of visits, maybe double-digit visits, are ahead between now and signing day for Isaiah Williams. I think this is one where the summer officials will be big, but it won't be the be-all, end-all, because programs are going to want to get him on campus because of his value as a potential freaky pass rusher all the way through the 2025 season. So like you said, signing day is the day, but Isaiah has slowed down. He said, hey, look, he jokes about it. I've made 3 commitments. I can't make another one. Like, my
Right.
next one has to be my last one. So he was flirting with the summer decision window, but now it's starting to seem like, especially as these other schools get in, maybe I slow down and just take it all the way into the fall and inevitably all the way to National Signing Day. So I think that's likely the plan. I do think that he's aware of maybe the perception of him being indecisive. So as he matures and gets older, that's something he wants to push back against. So it's not going to slow down his recruitment. Again, as I said, it's not like he's a guy who is on the bottom of the board that has to secure a spot. I think all these schools will stay on him heavily until all is said and done in December. But I do think at the end of the day, Florida boy, has a lot of ties to the big three in state. So I think those three will almost round robin as the leader for Williams until it's over.
All right, another kid down in your neck of the woods, Antoine Sharp from Palm Beach Central High School, was offered by Florida State in October. Came here for a junior day visit, set up an official visit for June 6th with Florida State. Also going to visit, I believe, West Virginia and UCF right now. The other officials he has set up. What is your take on him as a player and where he kind of fits into the Florida State board right now?
Yeah, I'd love a snapshot of of that board because, as we mentioned, a lot of great linebackers in the state that Florida State is in on. We haven't even talked about a few other ones. So I do think that he's probably in the middle somewhere, between some of the guys that we've already talked about. Sharp is one who has a great frame, another 6'2", 6'3" kind of kid, but he's got a lot of room to fill out. I think he's one that maybe is a little more old school compared to an Isaiah Williams or even a Karon Maycock that you can do so many things with. I think Sharp is probably a little bit more built to live and stay within the box, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean,
No.
we just saw at the highest level sort of the resurgence of the running back and the running game and the importance there, and that's really tackle to tackle where Antoine Sharp shines brightest, and that always filters down to the collegiate level. Heck, I mean, Ohio State, Michigan, the last 2 years, very much run dominant, line of scrimmage heavy program. So I do think there's still a role for a guy like that. Just maybe not as versatile as some of the others on the list, but nonetheless got the frame and can be added upon. So I think there's still some untapped ceiling that Sharp can get to from a physical standpoint. But right now, tackle to tackle downhill, going to be a triple digit tackle kind of guy, in a conventional scheme. So still a lot of value there, and a recruitment that is still sort of bubbling. He's not as well known, outside of the region. So I do think that, this one can still have some twists and turns depending on who jumps in. But Florida State, from an in-state perspective and from a prestige perspective, one of the first Power Fours to really dig their teeth in on this recruitment, despite some of the transition on the staff, which I think says a lot about where FSU could stand here. Kind of like we said with Forkba, how much does FSU push,
Right.
to wrap this thing up this summer?
All right. Then one other West Palm linebacker, Adam Balaguan Ali. Now, listen, he was on campus in January for Florida for an unofficial visit. I did have some communication with him earlier in the week, or the latter part of last week, excuse me. And right now, there's not any plans to get back on FSU's campus in March or April. But I think there's a little bit of rhyme to his reason. He's going to take about, if he's right, if I'm right, I've got him listed down for at least 7 unofficial visits in the spring. Then what he says he's going to do is come out of those unofficial visits, including Florida State's in January, and determine which of those schools are going to get officials. That list includes Missouri, Auburn, North Carolina, Penn State, Colorado, Florida, and Clemson. Obviously, one thing that may help Florida State in this is he's got 2 teammates that are now at Florida State, Ricky Knight III and Max Redmond. But what are your thoughts on Adam and where Florida State is with him and where he is in his recruiting process?
Yeah, and he played with Amari Williams, at the other school down the line earlier in his career as well. So a lot of 5'6" to Tallahassee, familiarity, for Adam, and I think that's a great starting point for Florida State. As you mentioned, he's on the slower side of developing, his true lists of finalists. But I would be shocked if, when that dust settles, Florida State is not only on the list, but really in the thick of it.
Yeah.
Top 2 or 3 at worst for a kid like this. It's been a long-term play for FSU, and he's a bit more unconventional, right? I mean, he's a great basketball player, so the spring is tough for him to sort of lock things in. So I do think that has become part of the reason why he's delayed, trying to lock in some of these visits, both in the spring and thereafter. But very calculated kid, one who has been a big name for, kind of like we talked about with Trey Bell, has been a big name for a couple of years now. So he's been able to develop different types of relationships with multiple coaching staffs. But in terms of Florida State, very, very familiar with Tallahassee and what is expected under Mike Norvell, especially with those former teammates that are now there for good, right? That stuff is a true inside track, and there's not another program on his list that has that familiarity like Florida State, whether it's with personnel or the territory itself. So I think that one could be a bit of a longer burn compared to some of these other guys, just because there is so much going on and there are so many contenders at this time. But again, like I said, when that dust settles, Florida State will be in the thick of that race. So it's going to be at that time, if he decides later than a lot of these other guys we've talked about, it's really going to be a matter of where he is on the board, and how many they're going to bring in, because these guys are all a little bit different. Ali's very good in coverage. I mean, that's really the first thing you notice, his length and ability to cover ground in space, very comfortable covering a running back or a tight end one-on-one, which is really invaluable in this day and age. But he's also, a big 6'2", 6'3" kid who's very comfortable coming down and racking up some tackles. So I think there's balance and some real 3-down value, with Ali. So a little bit different than some of these other guys that we've talked about. So it'll be fascinating to know like what those final numbers look like for Florida State, how many linebackers they want, and who they really, really go all in for. Because, no matter how you shake it, if you grab 2 or 3 of the guys we've talked about, it's going to be one of the best linebacker classes in the country.
Yeah, and one just real quick, because I'm not sure Florida State's involved. I know they'd like to be involved along with a lot of other people, but that is Jordan Campbell, the Miami commit. Any chance Florida State gets involved in this is the new staff builds relationships. Obviously Pappy just has been around, but he's the linebacker coach now. But White, obviously the rest of the coaches, Tony White, Evan Cooper, and Terrence Knight, are new. Any chance Florida State gets in with a kid like Jordan, or even maybe Simeon Caldwell, who their recruitment seemed to have taken on a national appeal? Any chance they get in with one of those kids?
Yeah, great linebacker group in the state of Florida, as we've kind of discovered on this show. I think with Campbell, there's absolutely a chance. He's begun taking visits elsewhere, in a school that really for a year that has been, viewed as a top threat, maybe the top threat right now, is Nebraska. So when you pull multiple coaches from that coaching staff, that continuity is going to carry over. And he has mentioned Florida State when talking about the broader picture, but he's kind of been a little back and forth. He is not, committed to a lot of official visits. I know Miami's got him locked in here, I think late May, early June, but there's some flexibility thereafter. He's mentioned Oregon, Florida State, certainly a return trip to Nebraska looks like it's all but likely. And he's also considering keeping it more narrow than that, so I think he's kind of in a point of transition to where he's really going to open it up or keep it real narrow with a contender or two, to keep in mind, in addition to Miami, where he's been committed almost as long as Trey Bell's been on board with Florida State. So it won't be an easy pull for anyone, but obviously you take your chances with a top 100 guy like that.
All right. If you're just joining us on the podcast version of this, I'm being joined by Rivals National Recruiting Analyst John Garcia, and we just talked about FSU's linebacker targets. I want to move on to some of the DB targets. Tadarius Hughes, he seems like he's pretty much a lock for Florida State, as much as you can be 10 months away from National Signing Day. But Syracuse has nailed down a commitment. They're doing a really good job of recruiting down there in South Florida. They've gotten a number of official visits set up with prospects down there. The real threat to me, based on everything that the kid has told us and you've read and heard, Miami would seem to be the biggest threat. He's got an official visit locked in with them for May 30th. Will be in FSU on June 13th after his Syracuse visit. What do you make of Tadarius and where Florida State is with him?
Yeah, another one who is going to give Florida State the last trip, at least of the 3 visits that he talked to us about earlier this week. So I do think that's big. And I agree with you. I think Miami is the primary threat. He's a South Florida guy. He's a South Dade, guy. So naturally, the location's always going to play paramount with Miami. But this is another one. Hey, committed pretty early to Florida State for a reason. He's always felt a pull up to Tallahassee. He reps FSU kind of at every turn, at every chance he gets, even on the 7-on-7 circuit, playing with South Florida Express. So, I do think this one is, due diligence, kind of like we said about Trey Bell. I do think that Tadarius is very solid to Florida State, but his profile is rising too. I mean, legitimate, 6'2", 6'3" player, can occupy some underneath zones, but he's got enough range to play some free safety as well. So there's a lot to like about his game. So that's one that, you wonder if 3 official visits is going to be the end. If that is the case, though, I do think, the most likely scenario in his recruitment is that he sticks with Florida State, at least at this time.
Yeah. Seems like a great kid too. I've had multiple interactions with him. Kind of mature beyond his years. Very responds almost every time. Most kids do not do that. All right. I know there's a kid that you really like down in South Florida. Is committed to Nebraska, and you just wrote about him. And I've been reading some things, on Twitter. But you a little bit locked in with CJ Bronall. The Nebraska commit. I know that you think Florida State is getting involved there. They're making a push. What do we need to know?
Yeah, he's going to take visits for sure. This was, again, the Nebraska coaching staff, super early evaluation. They got him committed last fall when really he was known as a track guy. A lot of people were still, curious if this was a track guy who happened to play football or a football player who just happens to be incredibly fast.
Right.
And I think the latter has become the obvious perception around CJ. But the numbers are crazy. Sub 21 in the 200, 10.33, and he's 6'1", 180 pounds. It's not like he is a little, compact, sprinter. This is a long cornerback prospect, and he's got ball skills. 6 picks and I think 7 games last year up at Windermere High School in the Orlando area. So this was one that the recruitment was always bubbling because of those crazy times. But I think people seeing him at Under Armour Orlando last week, 6'1", filled out, 180 pounds, and covering very well. He won DB MVP, at that event, covering very well, not just being a speed guy. I think that is going to, have his recruitment go crazy. But Florida State's already in, LSU is already in, Syracuse, as you mentioned, who loves the state of Florida, they're already in, Penn State as well. So there's already a good group of programs that are willing to play ball here with CJ. And he said, hey, I'm committed to Nebraska, but I got to take these trips because when he picked the Cornhuskers, that was kind of the scholarship offer for him. This was not even a regional race. This was hey, I got a chance to play in the Big Ten. I probably need to take it kind of deal. And obviously kudos to that staff, which is partially at Florida State now for that early eval, but no doubt the bulk of this race is still well ahead, for CJ Bruno, who again is still somewhat under the radar. I think, he's another one as more track times come out, as spring football rolls around, he's one that could be a 20 or 30 offer guy before all is said and done. But no doubt Florida State's in the thick of it right now, and I'd be shocked if they didn't get a visit, maybe a spring visit and certainly an official visit.
Yeah. Now, obviously, as we've talked about it, it's never over until they sign the dotted line, and that's the way it's been forever and ever. But some commitments mean more than others, as we both know. But Florida State's chances of landing one of its DB targets took a hit today when Xavier Larisi, I believe that's how you say his last name, had committed to Oregon. He was supposed to visit FSU on June 22nd for an official. That may still happen. But what do you think about Florida State's chances, or really anybody else's chances, of getting him now that he is committed to Oregon? Or does the fact that Oregon is a world away continue to keep Florida State and Miami and those type of programs in this?
Yeah, I can see this one going either way. This is a kid who has always talked up Oregon with us at every turn. We thought the officials would be huge relative to the Ducks' chances, but after an unofficial visit out there and the staff visiting him in late January, I think he kind of felt like he's learned everything he needed to know about the Ducks enough to jump in with a verbal commitment. But we spoke a little bit earlier today after I congratulated him, and he said, "Look, I'm still not sure about these official visits." So he didn't shut it down. He didn't say, I'm not taking visits, and Oregon doesn't have a no visit policy like some schools, which is archaic in this day and age to consider. So I do think he's going to mull those things. And he said, I'm just going to take a few days and enjoy this and reassess at a later time, which is for Florida State, Miami, whoever else, Notre Dame. I mean, this is
Yep.
great news. You on commitment day, you typically get, I'm shutting it down. I'm a duck. I'm done. So to get anything but that, I thought was pretty interesting for potentially everyone else in this race. And this is a very good player, 3-phase guy, 3-sport player as well. So I think his, kind of like we talked about with Isaiah Williams, his talent level will command so much attention that it would almost be an upset if he didn't take official visits. I just think that's become such a normal part of the process. So you love the early commitment. Certainly Dan Lanning's going to take it as they maybe look like, the team that's going to have the number one class here in a few weeks. But that race is certainly not over when you're talking about a Floridian who's extremely coveted, and Xavier is absolutely one of those guys. So I check back in with him here in a few weeks, but I'd be surprised if at the end of the day, whether it's the planned trips in June or some new developing trips that he maybe pushes to the fall and links them up with game day weekends at School X, I'd be surprised if he took 0 official visits beyond Eugene, Oregon, between now and December.
Well, and I do think this. I do think in particularly the new era of college football where there is money involved. I think that you need to, whether it's with Oregon or whoever a kid's committed to. I mean, I think you got to try to leverage your standing with that school. It's just like. I'll ask you this question later about tampering, but I don't think you're doing. If I had a son that was being recruited, I would want him to not only make sure that he was going to the right places, but the right place by checking out other places, but also in today's world, increase your worth, your value to a program, and it's turning into probably more of a game than it ever has been before. All right, so one other, I guess, high-profile prospect I want to ask you about, because he just received an offer from Florida State on the 24th of February, which is shocking to me for a top, as hard as defensive tackles are to find. They're one of the, after offensive line, they're the hardest position to find in high school. But Elijah Golden gets an offer from Florida State. He's rated the number 19 defensive tackle by Rivals. Can Florida State? He's told us he wants to try to get to Florida State. My read on try after with a kid that has been to Notre Dame multiple times on unofficial visits means he's probably not coming. But can Florida State, with a new staff and a defensive line coach that has a track record of being an NFL player and developing some players in his career, can Florida State get in on a kid like Elijah and what would be considered a late date for such a high-profile prospect?
Yeah, I think the timing has been interesting here, no doubt. But Elijah was excited to get that scholarship offer. He's another kid that we just saw over the weekend. And talking to him then, it really just seemed like things were not as accelerated as we thought. Like earlier in his recruitment, it looked like, this is a kid from Virginia originally, before going to IMG and then Cardinal Mooney and Sarasota. It looked like, hey, he basically told us, I'm a Big Ten kind of guy. If Ohio State, Notre Dame, Michigan, those kind of schools come in, I'm probably done. Well, those schools came in,
Yes.
but he's still open and he's still earning scholarship offers. So I think, when you move down to Florida, I do think it changes a lot of your perception, not only on the sport of college football itself, but where you want to place yourself within that sport. So I do think Notre Dame's still absolutely, in this race, maybe in the driver's seat. North Carolina's in there as well, but closer to his new home, Florida's starting to feel pretty good, and now Florida State is in there. And he told us he's going to take that official visit if it works out. So yeah, I think logistics are going to be a part of this because he's got a lot still to figure out, and he's another one that's going to take a lot of visits, and that list is materializing. So it feels late in general, but maybe not too late for Florida State to at least take their swing at another blue chipper who's got an inside out game that you like. He's like 255, so you could see him gaining weight and being a true, three tech, or you could see him staying relatively trim, 270, 280, and being a guy who, plays inside on certain downs. So I think there's, a lot of room, for this recruitment to take a twist or turn, because it has not gone as expected to this point. So yeah, the idea of staying, an SEC and ACC country is a lot more appealing today than it was a year or 18 months ago, for him. So I think that trend is only going to push further, as he gets, closer to his senior season as well. So yeah, Florida State is not too late in this race, although it is relatively late, for the position, especially with now an in-state guy like Elijah Golden.
Well, I guess the good news for Florida State here is that they're not the only power brand that has gotten in what you and I would consider late, because just in the month of January and February, he has picked up offers from Georgia, Alabama, Oregon, Penn State, Texas, Oklahoma. So, so I think that probably helps Florida State's chances with him too, because those guys have not been recruiting him for a year, 2 years, that type of thing. All right, so let's kind of move on big picture. I asked Sam this last week. Well, I do want to ask you this: do you have because everybody loves to talk about quarterbacks, that it's the position that makes things go. Do you have any thoughts on where FSU is going with the quarterbacks? Obviously, Brady Schmeigel decommitted. After that evening, by the end of the evening, Florida State had offered Houston commit Keyshawn Henderson, Bo Bentley, spelled Bowe, because I called him Bowie, figuring he's from Texas, Bowie. And then, of course, you've got Landon Duckworth, who's been offered, and Landon seems to be the kid they have the best relationship with. But again, it's particularly late for a quarterback. But to that end, Florida State got in on Kevin Sperry very late in the cycle last year. Where do you think Florida State is going to ultimately end up when it comes to the quarterback carousel?
Yeah, I think it's a true carousel. A lot of people are curious for multiple schools. So I think Florida State, Auburn, a lot of these schools are still looking for their guy. Georgia is as well. So I think a lot of dominoes are going to fall once we get our answer on Jared Curtis. He's down to Oregon and Georgia, a guy that a lot of programs have very high on the board. So if he does kind of go with the trend and pick the Ducks, I do think that, where Georgia pivots to will be interesting. They're in it for Duckworth. They're in it for some of these other uncommitted guys, and they're going after some committed guys as well. They offered Diabell, the Texas commit, recently as well. So I think Georgia will be an interesting player, in the search for a 26 QB. But Curtis has the ball in his court, and then I think thereafter there's going to be some clear dominoes. And yeah, I think Landon Duckworth is fascinating for Florida State. Mega relationship with Gus Malzahn.
Yep.
I mean, when he decommitted from South Carolina, talking Duckworth, the next day it was like, yeah, UCF's my leader, Gus Malzahn's my guy, and you just knew that Gus would be a player in this thing before all is said and done. Problem is, obviously, coaching transition to Florida State on Gus's end, but then on Duckworth's end, he goes on this magical run to a state championship in Alabama, and now all of a sudden he's a national recruit. Ole Miss is pushing. Georgia looks like they're going to get a visit. Florida State looks like they're going to get a visit. So he's taking it real slow, and I would imagine he's got his eyes on Jared Curtis as well. He's a very big domino, in this race. So I think, he's absolutely the first name Florida State fans should keep an eye on is Landon Duckworth. Bentley's interesting. He does have a trip penciled in, I believe, for about a month away from now. And
March 22nd.
But he's going to visit a bunch of schools, right?
Yeah.
Some of the same schools we've talked about that is searching for its guy throughout SEC, ACC country. Bentley's a fast riser like Duckworth, who has really upped his stock and picked up a bunch of scholarship offers. The interesting school for me with him, though, is Oklahoma. He grew up a big OU fan. He's a Texas kid. So if they basically move on from Jaden O'Neal in favor of Bentley and take his commitment, because I don't think O'Neal's going to play the 2 QB game,
right,
then maybe Jaden O'Neal, opens things back up, and FSU looks to flip another former Oklahoma verbal commitment. And this is a big physical kid who, interestingly enough, plays with South Florida Express in the 7-on-7 circuit. So he plays with Tadarius Hughes. He plays with a lot of Florida State commitments and targets. So I think that could be an interesting twist in this race. But as always, Pat, you just got to look at, like you said, the broad scope of the QB dominoes, because they're going to start falling here pretty soon. For those curious, Curtis has March trips to both Georgia and Oregon set, and we think the decision's coming right after that. So once he pops in about a month, Bentley takes his trips. I think we get some answers there. And then you're looking at Duckworth. Where does he spend his time for official visit season? I don't think he's set any official visits at this point. So again, basketball player, he's on the camp circuit too, so he's a busy kid as well. But it does tell you that he's got his eye out, or those around him have their eye collectively out on the QB carousel, because it's a very good year at the quarterback position nationally, and Florida State is involved with several of these guys. You know, Henderson committed to Houston, hometown school. You know, we think, you know, that's where he's going to end up. But, you know, Florida State, LSU, Florida, Georgia, they've all inquired more and more about Henderson as a quarterback. And I think that's the difference. Everyone's loved him as an athlete, but now everyone's starting to view him as a quarterback, which is what he's always wanted. So initially it was like, Houston, hometown, they'll take me as a quarterback. That's what I'm going to do. Well, now everyone is talking QB with him. So for him, it's going to be a decision of, do I stick with Houston and stay loyal, or do I do a little bit of due diligence to start taking trips? If he starts to book trips, I think this thing is blown wide open from a QB dominoes perspective. But there's no indication for sure, you know, that Henderson is going to do that. He's still trying to figure that out. So this is going to be an elongated period for Florida State to try to find its guy in 26. But all these names we've talked about are blue chipper, big time quarterback talent. So you got to swing for the fences first, and let's see where the dust settles thereafter. But these are the names to know, and they all sort of affect each other. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I think part of it, for particularly the quarterback, I think it's going to be, I don't think so, you know, I think you might get a commitment before the season starts, you know, but I think, and you can agree, tell me if you agree or disagree, but I think part of it, coming off the season that Florida State just had, I think some of their success at quarterback, particularly, is going to be driven by what they see on the field this year. How much better is it? You know, you would think that it would be better with bringing in a veteran offensive line that's basically built through the portal, which was really the issue last year, you know, or for the entire offense. But how do you think and we can talk about not only the quarterbacks, but this entire class. And listen, it's only 7 kids, but they are ranked 11th. They've had some success early in this cycle. How important, and I guess in a lot of ways it's a rhetorical question, but there could be different versions of what improvement looks like depending on, you know, what the 2025 season looks like on the field. I mean, do they flip it all the way around and make a 9 or 10 game run, or is it more in the middle? But how do you think that's going to affect the 2026 class? What happens on the field in 2025?
Yeah, it's critical. There's no doubt. I mean, there's no position that is watching development or lack thereof like the quarterback position, because obviously you're thrusting yourself into that room. So the combination of the expected bounce back in Tallahassee, the new coaches in town, and how Norvell and Malzahn will mesh together to create what should be a pretty darn modern offense.
Yep.
You know, how all of that works will be fascinating. But if you look at a lot of these programs that are still hunting for their guy in 26, Georgia has questions there. Auburn has questions there. They're not alone. You know, Florida State's not alone in that part of the conversation. So there's no doubt that it's going to, you know, be predicated on how improvement is viewed by each quarterback prospect. But you could also sell the other side of that, right, Pat? You know the game. If things aren't working, you say, hey, you come make it work. You come be the guy day one.
You are the savior.
Stop going to the portal and stop doing these other things. So there's always a sell, you know, in recruiting. But there's no doubt that the QB position, obviously, those kids are more thorough. They got a lot more at stake with the decisions they make. So even when the commitment season dies down, you know, in July and August, you're still going to have some movement thereafter. It just inevitably happens every cycle. Look at last year, huge, great year at the top at the quarterback position. And you had flips from what, 3 5-stars? Bryce Underwood went from
Yep.
LSU to Michigan. Keelan Russell went from SMU to Alabama. Juju Lewis goes from USC to Colorado, all during the season itself. And the
Yep.
season itself had a lot to do with it for all of those guys. So I do think that, you know, the commitment status is important. You want to get your QB and allow him to build the class. Obviously, Kevin Sperry flipped, you know, from Oklahoma to Florida State. You know, that process is important, but it's not the be all end all, because inevitably, just like the coaching carousel, the QB carousel will always have its say, you know, before signing day as well. So yeah, this is going to be a huge year, you know, for a lot of reasons in Tallahassee, and QB recruiting is certainly one of them.
All right, last question, and I probably didn't ask Sam the same question last week. Now you're a little bit more local to Tallahassee and Florida State's prime recruiting area, and I probably asked the question the wrong way because you guys have to deal with the coaches that left here at other colleges. But have you seen a spike or any kind of momentum in Florida State's recruitment in South Florida, the state of Florida, maybe even the Southeast, with the addition of Gus Malzahn, Herb Hand, Tim Harris Jr., who obviously is from Miami, Terrence Knighton, Tony White, Evan Cooper? Have you seen a spike, and do you think you've seen improvement? Because they do seem to have some momentum coming off what was not a great year, to say the least. What's your take on how this revamped staff is recruiting right now as a whole?
Yeah, I think prospects are viewing this in two different ways. On one hand, they're saying, "Hey, some of these new coaches I already have a relationship with, right? Coaches coming from Nebraska, coming from UCF in particular, you know, you're going to have relationships in Florida. Both of those programs rely on the Sunshine State to a certain degree. So I think the familiarity helps, and everyone loves a fresh start in general. So I think that was sort of one side of it. The other side of it, and the more important side of it, is kids have told me they see a fight in Mike Norvell. We talked about, you know, this impending transition, you know, that everyone assumes could happen or could have happened last year. But when you kind of fight through that and you do start to make those necessary changes, kids realize that. And they're saying that about Mike at this point. And this won't be a popular, you know, response on this show, but kind of reminds me a little bit of last year at the Florida Gators, where everyone said Billy Napier was cooked.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden, you know, they make some changes and they go on a little bit of a run. And all of a sudden, Florida finished with the top recruiting class in the state of Florida for the first time in a while. So I do think that there is something to be said for that momentum and that perception of, hey, this head coach is going to, you know, dig his cleats in and fight, you know, for the program that he's at right now. And multiple recruits have told me they don't expect Florida State to stay down. They respect Mike Norvell enough, you know, to that this thing is going to bounce back, and they like the culture and the fight that he is employing in that process while making those necessary changes. So again, kids are more mature now, man. I couldn't imagine being 17 trying to sift through all of this. But the people that they have around them, the teams, literally agents and you know, agencies around these kids, they're getting more informed opinions on these programs. And the turnaround has been positive with Florida State. You know, I think even on how they ended last cycle after losing the bulk of the class to still fight through and finish with a nice group, you know, even that I think showed the 26 recruits, you know, that, hey, this thing's not going to stay down for very long. So I think the arrow is certainly pointed up from a perceptional perspective. And that's important in recruiting because, you know, even though they are mature, they're still teenagers at the end of the day. So that perception is still very much, you know, important in the process.
Yeah, and Florida State's still got a great brand. I mean, you got 3 national championships. Not a lot of schools can say that, and obviously two years removed from an undefeated regular season. And listen, I agree with you. I agree with what the kids have told you. I don't know when Mike knew that there were issues last year, but I will say this: when I got a chance to be around him down on campus in January during the portal, and January and February unofficial visits, he seemed like he had renewed enthusiasm. I mean, he really did seem like, all right, I've got guys in the foxhole with me that I want in the foxhole. I do think, and listen, it's hard to believe that maybe he needed to revamp that staff after 5 years, but what happened on the field certainly made that happen for sure. But I do think with the new blood that he has brought in, he certainly does have renewed energy. And listen, I do think Mike's a fighter. I don't doubt that at all. So that does kind of rhyme with what we've seen from Mike on campus when we've had the opportunity to kind of be around him for brief moments of time when he'll come outside the building and kind of chat us up a little bit. Ask us why we're stalking outside the building. But anyway, I appreciate it, John. Thanks as always for joining us. We'd love to have you back and hope you'll be back. If you're not a subscriber to the Osceola YouTube channel, before you log off, if you're watching this the YouTube version of that, please hit the subscribe button and the notification button so that you get alerted on live and tape shows, Seminole Sidelines. And obviously, if you're listening via podcast, please sign up for the podcast, the Osceola podcast, on whatever stream or whatever avenue you use for your podcast. And even more importantly, if you're not a subscriber to the Osceola, where you can get all our recruiting content and all our coverage of Florida State baseball, basketball, softball, and golf and everything else that's going on right now, in addition to recruiting, please go to theosceola.com or floridastate.rivals.com and check us out. And hey, subscribe, give us a chance, see what you like about our coverage. But John, we appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will have you back soon, I hope. And we appreciate all our subscribers, whether YouTube subscribers, Osceola subscribers, listening or watching. And we'll be back next week with another edition of the Osceola Seminole Sidelines. Everybody have a great day.